Hi, this is Dr. Kevin, your portable pastor, with today's 5 by 5 Bible study on Revelation chapter 9, Truth or Lie, Humility or Pride. Now, we have just finished talking about the first 4 trumpets in chapter 8, and in chapter 8 we saw how that started, and now we're going to get the continuation of the next 2 of the 7 trumpets and this judgment series from God in chapter 9. What's important in chapter 9 is that the focus is now on unrepentant people, and we'll get into that very shortly. But at the end of chapter 8, in verse 13, we talk about 2 woes, and somehow these 2 woes are now integrated somehow into these 2 trumpets here in chapter 9. So when you think about that, I want you to think about the George Lucas stories and the Star Wars saga, how each of the different episodes or each of the different movies and films can be identified separately, and you can watch them independently and understand what's happening. But in some cases, there is an underlying theme, or somehow they're knit together and integrated together to make a whole of some sort. But the timeline is oftentimes hard to fix and hard to put together, as with apocalyptic literature, what we are studying here. So I want you to think about George Lucas and how he writes the Star Wars saga when you're thinking about how the woes and the trumpets are integrated together. Okay, let's get started with points 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we'll do this very briefly as usual. Point number 1 is we're talking about trumpets here, and these next 2 trumpets, like everything, is about judgment. And when we think about trumpets, we hear the trumpets from the time of Joshua, right? And so when Joshua is going around the walls of Jericho with the people, the city of Jericho falls at the sound of the trumpets, and that final time the trumpet blares. And when that happens, we think of the fall and the destruction of the city and the unrighteous world. Now, when we think about the trumpets here and the fall, we're talking about, specifically in the time of John, the fall of Rome. And Rome has the metaphor of Babylon, and we'll see that a bit later on, where Babylon falls and these trumpets begin that sound of judgment to the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire, as we know it from that point in John's history. Now, the metaphor for Babylon is used not only for Rome here, but you can use it throughout history. The metaphor of Babylon could be used for the Assyrians, for the Persians, or even for Nazi Germany. And of course, that future evil empire that's coming up will represent the unrighteous world at that point in all of its glory and so forth. So think of those 2 things. Now, when we think about trumpets 5 and 6, we mentioned the unrepentant. Now, the unrepentant are those with allegiance to Satan, those who, regardless of what's going to happen, is going to give all their devotion to him. So the demons and the demon forces here in chapter 9 are authorized by Jesus, authorized by God, to bring this judgment against the unrepentant, who are going to be stuck in their own ways and their own thoughts. Now, how do we know that it's an authorization? Because the king of the demons has the key to the abyss, the key to the bottomless pit. And when we think of chapter 1, and remember chapter 1, Jesus had the keys, right? So what I want you to think about is that Jesus is still on the throne. God is on the throne, and they are co-regents together, reigning over everything. It's just like chapter 1 of Job, when God was still on the throne. Everything was still under his sovereignty and control, and there was an authorization for Satan at the time to do what he did with respect to Job. Just like there's an authorization here for Satan and his forces to do what God wills him to do. So no matter how tough it looks to you, my friends, remember that Jesus is the one with the keys. He is the one with all the authority. He is the one on the throne and in control and in sovereign control over everything. All right, let's go to point number 2. And when we talk about point number 2, we have to skip to verses 20 and 21 to talk about the unrepentant. Now, as we mentioned, chapter 9 is really about the judgments against the unrepentant. So those who are the righteous and faithful ones don't really have to focus on this chapter so much, as much of this will not be affecting them directly, but will affect the unrepentant. And how do we know this? We know this because they're still stuck in their pride. That no matter after all that happened, in chapter 9, they were still unrepentant. They would not serve God, and they would not understand or see the truth of what's going on in the world and what's going on with heaven and hell and the eternal soul that they have. They could not see it, and they were deceived. And so this unrepentant reminds us of that Exodus story where the Egyptians and Pharaoh himself were unrepentant and hard of heart. They stuck in their own ways and they would not change, and it ended in their destruction and devastation. So think of that when you're thinking of all of chapter 9 and the unrepentant and the different judgments that are coming forth. Our point number 3 here is about the deceived and these deceived ones. And in the first part of chapter 9, the deceived ones and the unrepentant ones are deceived because of the destroyer, right? And because the demons come forth to them, and not only do they destroy them necessarily, but what do? Is they torment them in the first half. In the second half of chapter 9 is when the killings happen and when the demons kill actual unrepentant people. But before we get there, here it's more of a torment. Now we're also introduced to the destroyer himself, and that destroyer we know is Satan, who is also the deceiver. So when you think of the destroyer, some major characters throughout film and comics that you can think of course, in the DC universe is Brainiac, right? And you can also remember Marvel comics when Thanos is the destroyer of worlds. So we have some destroyer of worlds and some other figures and characters too, if I remember, in these comic series. But in any case, Thanos, for example, is a destroyer of worlds. And he was not only a master manipulator and deceiver, but he was also self-deluded himself and also believed the lies and the delusion and the deception himself. So first of all, he thought that it was okay to go ahead and kill everyone, and he was going to deceive everyone into thinking that this was good. But he himself thought that this was a good thing. To kill more than half of the universe was somehow a good thing. So he himself could not see the truth. And that's what happens with deception. You're not able to see the truth of what's happening. You're not able to see the spiritual truth specifically of what's going on, because there are spiritual truths that deception comes and clouds and covers our eyes and prevents us from seeing what's going on in this eternal arena, in this infinite arena of the spiritual. And so think of Thanos when you're thinking of the destroyer of worlds, and when you're thinking of Satan and how he's the deceiver and how he himself is also self-deluded and deceived himself. Now some other images for deception here in chapter 9 are the smoke and the darkness. And so remember, the darkness is you cannot see through, so there's a deception element involved in darkness and smoke. You cannot see through that, so there's a deception element there as well. And if you remember, at the end of chapter 9, those who are deceived serve the gods and serve the world system who they themselves could not deceive. And that goes back to what we spoke about Thanos, who, cannot see himself and cannot understand himself the truth, is self-deluded himself and propagates deception and this delusion on others throughout the world. And these are the ones who become the unrepentant. So we see here there's a lot with regard to the Exodus story, and we see that coming up again in the next section. Now before we do that, I want to mention a bit of good news in chapter 12, where the deception now is turned around. Right? Because here in chapter 9 we see the tails and the mouths are used for deception and are used to propagate the deception. However, in chapter 12 the witnesses and the overcomers use their mouths to produce the truth, use their mouths to tell the truth, and it's a strong truth that is being proclaimed and presented in chapter 12. So bear in mind there is good news. So the tongue and the mouth can be used for either. It could be used for deception on a massive scale, and it could also be used for truth on a massive scale, depending on where your heart is. Are you prideful, or are you humble before God? Are you willing to be humble to him and proclaim his truth of his love for the world? Okay, let's get to point number 4. So now, not only are the demons tormenting the unrepentant, but now the demons are authorized to kill the unrepentant. And here it's not too dissimilar from our time in Exodus, when the angel of death came by, and at their hands they killed quite a number of the population there. And here we'll see about 1/3 of the unrepentant population, not the total population of the world, but 1/3 of the unrepentant population of the world who will lose their lives, and that will be a kind of judgment. Now it's up to the rest who are still living to see and say, oh wow, this is some serious stuff, and I need to see the truth somehow in all of this. Sadly, many will not do so, as we learned at the end of chapter 9. So what we talked about, the angel of darkness there, and we also see some figures here of sulfur and smoke and fire and all of these things. And what does that remind us of in the Old Testament? Not only the angel of darkness, but it also reminds us of that Sodom and Gomorrah story. Lots of sulfur, lots of destruction, prideful people involved who would not see the truth. That was a big thing, right? We learned that from the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. They were very prideful people. They propagated lies. They were very harmful and hurtful to their neighbors and the people in surrounding communities as well as their own people. And they suffered because of that. Their city was destroyed. But instead of going through that whole story again, I want to direct you to Luke chapter 17, where Jesus talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. And the lesson that he punctuates that story in chapter 17 of the Gospel of Luke is with this saying that if you want to, those who want to save their lives will actually lose their lives, right? So if you want to save your natural or physical life, you'll actually lose it. But if you lose your life for the sake of Christ and for God, then you will find it. You'll not only find that natural life or that physical life, but you'll also find eternal life, that spiritual life for all eternity. Friends, when we talk about truth, we're talking about a spiritual matter. We're talking about an eternal situation and a spiritual situation. Our souls only last maybe about 100 years in this body here on earth. And then after that, our souls have to go somewhere. Are we going to be with the truth? Are we going to see the light and be in heaven with God forever in an infinite eternity, in a spiritual universe where there is light and truth? Or are we going to be deceived by the Satan himself, the devil, the destroyer of worlds, in an eternal hell and in a place that is going to be far separated from truth and life? You know, when we think about Romans chapter 1, we see there that Jesus came, or God came and presented the truth to humanity. And there were some who were the faithful ones, who lived by faith because they accepted the truth. Then in Romans chapter 1, it goes to the next group of people who did not accept the truth, did not accept the love of God, did not accept the love of God through his son, Jesus Christ. They rejected the truth, and instead, they actually, what the Bible says there, they suppressed the truth, and they believed the lie instead of the truth. They exchanged the truth for a lie. They exchanged worshiping the creature instead of worshiping the Creator. And they were self-deluded and self-deceived into an eternity of deception and delusion, separation from God, and in a sense hell, right? Because separation from God is a hell. My friends, when we think about this, we think about what it means for our eternal soul. When we think about truth, we're not only talking about my story or my opinion, because I understand some people use that definition in a different way today, where they talk about truth as being my story or my opinion or my perspective. Now, while my story is a valid one, it is no substitute for the truth of God's love to us through Jesus Christ, for his truth and his word in general, for the truth that our eternal lives and our eternal souls with him in a spiritual realm in heaven matters, and matters very importantly. You know, that reminded me of John chapter 1, where it talks about truth and talks about Jesus as the truth. And I wanted to read that to you. John chapter 1, verses 9 to 13. The true light, which is Jesus, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born of God, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Friends, to accept Jesus is to accept truth. To accept the Spirit is to accept truth. You know, John chapter 14, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And he also says in John chapter 14 that I'm sending you another helper who is the Spirit of truth. Friends, to inherit life, to inherit the way, to inherit truth is to accept Jesus, is to accept the truth of God and his love for us, and that eternal sacrifice and that eternal home that we will have with him in heaven. To accept Jesus is to accept truth. To accept the Spirit is to accept truth. And to accept truth is to accept an eternal home with God the Father in heaven forever. If you have any other questions on this topic or any other topic, feel free to post it right here on this YouTube video, or you can send it to yourportablepastor@gmail.com, yourportablepastor@gmail.com. Send your prayer requests there too as well. Email yourportablepastor@gmail.com. Remember our campaign of understanding, #YourSmileForEveryone @portablepastor. This is Dr. Kevin with Portable Pastor LLC, blessing you with the spiritual fruit of self-control. See you next time, and remember to like and share.